The starship corridor seemed to shift around her, its sterile walls blurring as Lyra hurried through the labyrinthine passages of Nexus Space Station. Her silver-tinged skin caught the artificial light, giving her a subtle glow that contrasted with the growing panic in her multichromatic eyes. As a Xylosian ambassador's chief diplomatic advisor, she was never late, never lost, and certainly never flustered. Yet here she was, all three at once. The interplanetary summit would begin in less than 2 hours. 2 hours to find her way back to the diplomatic quarter, prepare her notes, and assume the perfect composure expected of a high-ranking Xylosian. The thought of failure made her quicken her pace, her normally graceful movements becoming rushed and uncharacteristically harried. Station navigation systems experiencing temporary disruption in residential sectors 7 through 12. "We apologize for any inconvenience," announced a pleasant but unhelpful automated voice overhead. Lyra suppressed the urge to respond with something undiplomatically colorful. She had specifically chosen to take the less traffic route to avoid being seen by other delegates before she was properly composed, and now she was hopelessly turned around in what appeared to be the residential quarters for transport workers. Each corridor looked identical to the last, with only subtle color coding that meant nothing to her. She paused, closing her eyes briefly to center herself. Xylosians prided themselves on logical thinking and emotional control. There was a solution to every problem, if one could just think clearly enough. But the stress of the upcoming summit, where she would present arguments that could affect interstellar trade routes for the next decade, weighed heavily on her. When she opened her eyes, she noticed a door to her right sliding open with a soft hiss. She hadn't pressed anything, hadn't requested entry. The station's malfunctioning systems must have triggered it. For a moment, she stood frozen, uncertain whether to continue down the endless corridor or to step inside what might be a maintenance room with access to a different section. Before she could decide, a movement inside caught her attention. The room wasn't empty. Inside, sprawled across a chair that looked like it had been salvaged from at least 3 different furniture pieces, was a human. He was balancing a bowl of something brightly colored on his stomach while watching holographic projections of what appeared to be an ancient Earth sport. The room around him was the antithesis of Xylosian order. Clothes hung from unexpected places, tools were scattered across surfaces, and personal items from a dozen worlds created a chaotic museum of one person's travels. The human turned, spoon halfway to his mouth, and stared at her with equal surprise. Lyra began, immediately straightening her already perfect posture. The door opened unexpectedly. "I apologize for the intrusion." The man blinked, then laughed, a warm sound that seemed to fill the cluttered space. "Hey, no problem. These doors have been glitching all week." He sat up, setting his bowl aside. "Are you lost? You look a little out of place." Lyra bristled slightly at the implication of imperfection, but couldn't deny the truth of it. "I'm attempting to return to the diplomatic quarter. The navigation systems appear to be malfunctioning." "Yeah, they've been on the fritz since that solar flare last week." He stood, wiping his hands on his pants in a gesture that made Lyra wince internally. "I'm Jax, by the way, transport pilot. I am Lyra, diplomatic advisor to the Xylosian ambassador." She remained in the doorway, unwilling to fully commit to entering this chaotic domain. "Well, Lyra, diplomatic advisor to the Xylosian ambassador." He mimicked her formal tone with a smile that somehow wasn't mocking. "The diplomatic quarter is about as far from here as you can get on Nexus. We're deep in the transport crew quarters." Lyra fought to keep dismay from showing on her face. "I see. I should depart immediately then." "Wait," Jack said, holding up a hand. "The direct routes are probably still down. You'll just get more lost. Why don't you come in for a minute, catch your breath, and I can show you the maintenance shortcuts. I know this station like the back of my hand." Lyra hesitated. Every moment spent here was a moment not preparing for the summit. And yet, the thought of wandering those identical corridors for another hour was equally unacceptable. Logic dictated accepting local expertise. "Very well. I accept your offer of assistance." She stepped inside, the door sliding shut behind her. "Great. Make yourself at home. Well, As much as you can. Jax gestured vaguely at the room, seeming to notice its state through her eyes for the first time. Sorry about the mess. I just got back from a 3-week cargo run to the Epsilon colonies. Lyra carefully navigated around what appeared to be a partially disassembled engine component to reach a relatively clear chair. She perched on the edge, back straight, hands folded precisely on her lap. Can I get you anything? Water? I've got some Centauri tea that's not half bad. Water would be acceptable. Thank you. As Jax rummaged through a small cooling unit, Lyra took the opportunity to observe the room more carefully. Despite its disorder, there was something intriguing about it. Objects from dozens of worlds coexisted in cheerful disarray. A delicate crystalline sculpture from the Pleiades system next to what appeared to be a primitive wooden carving. Holographic photos showing diverse landscapes and groups of smiling beings. Technical manuals stacked alongside what she recognized as human fiction books. This room told a story of experience, of life lived across the stars. It was so different from her own pristine quarters, which were a model of Xylosian efficiency with nothing personal or unnecessary to distract from duty. Here you go. Jax handed her a slightly smudged glass of water. So, big diplomatic meeting coming up, huh? I've been hauling in supplies for it all week. Lyra accepted the glass, discreetly wiping the rim before taking a small sip. Yes, the Interstellar Trade Summit is of considerable importance. Sounds intense, Jax said, dropping back into his chair and picking up his forgotten bowl of food. What is that, anyway? Some kind of negotiation thing? She almost smiled at the simplification. In essence, yes. Though it will determine shipping routes, tariff structures, and resource allocation across 17 star systems for the next standard decade. Oh, so no pressure then, Jax grinned, shoveling a spoonful of brightly colored food into his mouth. What are you consuming? Lyra found herself asking, curiosity temporarily overriding her focus on returning to duty. This cereal. Ancient Earth comfort food. Basically just sugar and artificial coloring, but it reminds me of being a kid. He held out the bowl. Want to try? Lyra regarded the unnaturally colored mush with thinly veiled horror. No, thank you. Our nutritional requirements are quite specific. Jax laughed again. It's not about nutrition. It's about taste. Fun. You know, fun is not a significant consideration in Xylosian dining practices, she replied automatically, then paused, surprised at herself for continuing this inconsequential conversation. Well, what do you do for fun then? Jax asked, genuinely curious. Lyra opened her mouth to explain that productive use of time was the Xylosian ideal, but found herself hesitating. Did she even have an answer? Her life was her work, preparing reports, analyzing diplomatic strategies, perfecting her presentation for maximum persuasive impact. I engage in mental exercises to improve cognitive efficiency, she finally said. So, puzzles, Jax offered. In a manner of speaking, yes. Hey, I love puzzles too. He pointed to a complex, three-dimensional object on a shelf. That's a mechanical puzzle from Tau Ceti. Took me 3 weeks to solve it. Despite herself, Lyra found her gaze drawn to the object. It appeared to be comprised of interlocking pieces arranged in a mathematically intriguing pattern. The design principles are quite elegant. You want to try it? Jax was already standing, retrieving the puzzle. I really should be returning to my duties, Lyra said, but her hands automatically reached for the puzzle as he offered it. The weight of it was satisfying, the pieces cool and smooth against her fingers. Almost without thinking, she began to manipulate it, her mind automatically calculating angles and positions. Wow, you're really good at that, Jax commented after a few minutes of watching her swift, precise movements. Lyra felt an unexpected warmth at the compliment. Pattern recognition is valued in diplomatic work. A soft chime interrupted them, her communication device alerting her to a message. Reality crashed back in, and she quickly set the puzzle down. I must go. The summit preparations. Right, of course, Jax said, running a hand through his already disheveled hair. Let me just check the system status and figure out the best route for you. He moved to a console in the corner, tapping through screens. Lyra stood, straightening her formal attire, mentally calculating how quickly she could return and how much preparation time she would have left. "Looks like the main corridors are still down," Jax said, frowning at the display. "But I can show you the maintenance routes. It'll take a bit longer, but it's better than wandering in circles." Another chime from her device, more insistent this time. Lyra checked it, a message from the ambassador's assistant, inquiring about her whereabouts. She should leave immediately. She needed to leave immediately. Perhaps, she found herself saying, perhaps resting briefly would be more efficient. "I could wait until the navigation systems are repaired." Jax looked surprised, then pleased. "Sure, that makes sense. They usually fix these things pretty quickly. Want to watch something while you wait? I got a collection of films from just about every inhabited world." Logic told her this was inefficient. She should be making her way back, even if it was through maintenance corridors. And yet, something kept her rooted in this strange, cluttered room. Perhaps the puzzle she'd been enjoying, or the relief of not having to maintain perfect diplomatic composure for a few moments longer. Very well. A brief cultural exchange, maybe informative. Jax grinned, and despite all her training, Lyra found herself noticing how the expression transformed his face, creating small creases at the corners of his eyes and revealing slightly uneven teeth. It was imperfect, unplanned, and somehow compelling. "I've got just the thing," he said, turning to the entertainment system. "Classic Earth comedy. Translates pretty well to most species, I think." As the holographic display flickered to life, Lyra sent a brief message indicating she was working on summit preparations and would report in shortly. It wasn't entirely untrue. Cultural understanding was part of diplomacy, after all. She settled back in the chair, just slightly more relaxed than before, and prepared to endure what would undoubtedly be primitive humor for a polite interval before departing. 3 hours later, she was still there. Days turned into a blur of stolen moments. Lyra maintained her official duties, attending preliminary meetings, filing reports, preparing materials. But every free hour found her making her way back to Jax's quarters through routes she now knew by heart. The navigation systems had long since been repaired, but she no longer needed them. Her initial rationalization that this was valuable cultural research had gradually faded into honest acknowledgement, at least to herself, that she simply enjoyed being there. In Jax's chaotic room, with its treasures from across the galaxy and its complete lack of Xylosian efficiency, she found herself relaxing in ways she never had before. Jax seemed equally fascinated by her. He asked endless questions about Xylosian culture, seeming genuinely interested in her explanations of their logical governance structures and emotion regulation practices. Sometimes he challenged her perspectives, not with hostility, but with honest curiosity that made her reconsider ideas she had long taken for granted. "So you're telling me that Xylosians never do anything just because it feels good?" he asked one evening as they shared a meal, she with her nutritionally balanced Xylosian provisions. He was something spicy and aromatic that he called Thai curry. "That would be inefficient," she replied automatically, then paused, considering. "Though I suppose certain activities that have logical benefits might also produce pleasant sensations. Like solving puzzles," he suggested, gesturing to the collection of mechanical challenges they'd been working through together. She'd solved most of them faster than he had, but had been surprised to find he approached problems from angles she would never have considered. "Yes, precisely." She hesitated, then added, "And perhaps certain conversations that expand one's understanding might also be enjoyable." Jack smiled, that warm expression she'd grown surprisingly accustomed to. "Careful there, Ambassador. You almost admitted to having fun." "I am not an ambassador, merely an advisor," she corrected, ignoring the more significant implication of his statement. "You make a good one, though," he said, his tone shifting to something more serious. "You're really good at explaining things in ways that make sense, even to someone like me who never had any formal education in diplomacy." The compliment shouldn't have affected her. Xylosians were taught to disregard praise as irrelevant to duty performance, but she felt that strange warmth again. "Your perspectives are often insightful as well," she admitted. You approach problems differently than I would. Is that diplomatic speak for your chaotic mess? But sometimes it works out, he teased. A sound escaped her before she could prevent it. A small, surprised laugh. Jax's eyes widened. Was that a laugh? Did I just make a Xylosian laugh? Should I alert the interstellar press? Don't be absurd, she said, but there was no sting in her words. Xylosians are capable of laughter. We simply reserve it for truly significant moments. Am my joke qualified? I'm honored. He placed a hand over his heart in an exaggerated gesture. She should have corrected him, explained that her laughter had been an unintended response rather than a deliberate choice. Instead, she simply said, "You should be." This pattern continued as the summit date drew closer. During the day, Lyra was the perfect Xylosian diplomat. Logical, composed, focused on duty. But, increasingly, her mind wandered to the evenings in Jax's quarters, where they talked about everything from interstellar politics to his childhood on Earth's lunar colonies to the philosophical differences between their species. One night, as they sat together watching the stars through the small viewport in his quarters, Jax asked, "Don't you ever get tired of it? Having to be so perfect all the time?" Lyra's first instinct was to deny any such weakness. But something about the quiet darkness, with only the stars and Jax's attentive presence, made honesty easier. "Yes," she admitted softly. "It is exhausting to constantly monitor every word, every gesture, every thought for optimal efficiency and diplomacy. So why do it? It is what is expected, what is necessary for the advancement of Xylos in interstellar affairs." Jax was silent for a moment, then said, "You know, humans tried that approach too, at one point. Tried to make everything logical, efficient, perfect. Turns out we're really bad at it. Your species does seem particularly resistant to logical organization," she agreed, with what might have been a touch of humor. "Maybe. Or maybe we figured out that being perfect all the time isn't actually optimal. That sometimes chaos leads to creativity. Emotions lead to connections that logic might miss." Lyra considered this. It contradicted much of what she had been taught, yet she couldn't dismiss it entirely. Her time with Jax had certainly led to perspectives she wouldn't have discovered through purely logical analysis. "Perhaps there is some validity to that view," she conceded. Jax smiled, but this time it was different, softer, more intimate somehow. High praise from a Xylosian. Something shifted in the air between them. Lyra became acutely aware of how close they were sitting, of the low light casting shadows across his features, of her own quickened pulse that had nothing to do with efficient circulation. Her communication device chimed, shattering the moment. It was a message from the ambassador himself, requesting her presence for an emergency strategy session. The summit's opening was only 2 days away, and tensions between the Rigelian and Proximan delegations were threatening to derail proceedings before they began. "I must go," she said, standing quickly. "Of course," Jax nodded, understanding as always. Diplomatic emergencies wait for no one. She hesitated at the door. "I may be occupied with summit preparations for the next few days." "I understand. Go save interstellar relations. My messy room will be waiting whenever you have time." She smiled, a small thing by human standards, but significant for her, and departed. The next day and a half were consumed by intense negotiations and preparations. Lyra worked tirelessly, using all her diplomatic skills to help forge a temporary agreement between the feuding delegations while finalizing her own preparations for the Xylosian presentations. She was functioning at peak efficiency, and yet her mind kept returning to Jax's quarters, to conversations under the stars, to the way his presence made her feel simultaneously more relaxed and more alive than she'd ever been. It was illogical, distracting. She should focus entirely on her duties. And yet, when a brief break in preparations arose, she found herself walking not to her own quarters for rest, but to the now familiar path to Jax's room. The door opened at her approach. He programmed it to recognize her after the first week, and she stepped inside, feeling the now familiar sense of chaotic comfort wash over her. "Lyra." Jax looked up from a component he was repairing, surprise and pleasure evident on his face. I didn't expect to see you until after the summit. I had an unexpected interval in my schedule, she said, the formal phrasing at odds with the informal setting. I thought perhaps we could continue our discussion of interspecies philosophical variations. Sure. He grinned, setting aside his work. Just let me clean up a bit. I wasn't expecting company. As he moved around the room, making half-hearted attempts to create order that mostly resulted in shifting the chaos to new locations, Lyra realized how comfortable she felt here. The room still defied all principles of Xylosian organization, and yet it had become a sanctuary of sorts, a place where she could be less than perfect, where her occasional lapses in logic or composure were met with warmth rather than judgment. So, Jack said, dropping onto the couch beside her. Philosophical variations. That sounds suspiciously like you want to debate whether humans are hopelessly irrational again. Your species' relationship with rationality is certainly unique, she acknowledged, allowing herself a small smile. But perhaps there are benefits to your approach that we have overlooked. High praise indeed, he teased. Then his expression grew more serious. How are the summit preparations going? You look tired. I mean, for a Xylosian who's supposedly immune to exhaustion. We are not immune, merely disciplined, she corrected automatically. But yes, the preparations have been challenging. There are significant tensions between several key delegations. Anything I can help with? I'm pretty good at smoothing things over with difficult cargo clients. Might work on difficult diplomats, too. The mental image of Jax, with his casual manner and rumpled appearance, attempting to mediate between the formal Rigelian delegation and the ceremonial Proximans, almost made her laugh again. I appreciate the offer, but I believe traditional diplomatic approaches are required in this instance. Fair enough. Just thought I'd offer. He stretched, his tall frame extending in a way that briefly called her attention to the physical differences between their species. Humans were more variable, less symmetrical, their movements less precise, and yet there was a fluidity to them that Xylosians lacked. Actually, she found herself saying, there is perhaps one way you could assist. Name it. The Rigelian and Proximan delegations have fundamental philosophical differences regarding resource allocation. The Rigelians prioritize mathematical efficiency, while the Proximans value historical usage rights. I have been attempting to formulate an approach that acknowledges both perspectives. And you want my take on it? I'm hardly a diplomat. Precisely. You approach problems differently. Your perspective might reveal options I have not considered. And so they spent the next hour discussing interstellar trade policies, Lyra explaining the complexities of the dispute while Jax asked surprisingly insightful questions that forced her to examine her assumptions. By the end, she had several new approaches to consider, approaches that might never have occurred to her through purely Xylosian analysis. Thank you, she said sincerely as their discussion concluded. This has been most helpful. Anytime. Though I've got to say, this wasn't what I imagined when I first found a lost Xylosian at my door. I didn't think we'd end up discussing trade policies between star systems. What did you imagine? He shrugged, a casual gesture that she had come to find oddly expressive. I don't know. I guess I thought you'd get directions and leave. Maybe remember me as that messy human in your diplomatic reports. You have certainly been more memorable than that, she said quietly. Something in her tone made him look at her more intently. Is that a good thing? It is. Unexpected, but not unwelcome. The tension that had appeared between them the night before returned, stronger now. Lyra was acutely aware of human customs regarding physical proximity and emotional expression. She had studied them, of course, as part of her diplomatic training, but experiencing them firsthand was entirely different. Jax moved slightly closer. Lyra. Her communication device chimed again, multiple urgent messages. The summit's preliminary session had been moved up. She was needed immediately. She stood abruptly. I must go. Right. Duty calls. There was disappointment in his voice, but also understanding. I will return when I can, she promised, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. I'll be here. Probably making a bigger mess for you to disapprove of, he smiled, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. As she hurried through the corridors toward the diplomatic quarter, Lyra found her thoughts in unusual disarray. She had always been certain of her path: service to Xylos, advancement through the diplomatic ranks, participation in the logical governance of interstellar affairs. Her interactions with Jax had introduced unexpected variables into that equation. She enjoyed his company, more than enjoyed it. When she was with him, she felt free to explore aspects of herself that had no place in Xylosian diplomatic life. Curiosity not tied to duty, humor with no strategic purpose, connections based on something other than shared objectives. It was illogical, impractical, and increasingly important to her. The summit began in earnest, consuming almost every moment of Lyra's time. She worked tirelessly, applying her diplomatic skills and the new perspectives gained from her conversations with Jax. To her satisfaction, the approach she had developed with his input proved particularly effective in bridging the gap between the Rigelian and Proximan positions. Despite her success, however, she found herself increasingly distracted by thoughts of returning to his quarters, of continuing their conversations, of exploring the strange connection that had formed between them. Several times, she received messages from him, simple, thoughtful notes asking about her day or sharing amusing observations about station life. Each one produced an irrational surge of pleasure that she couldn't entirely suppress. 4 days into the summit, as she was reviewing materials in her office, her supervisor entered. "Advisor Lyra," the senior diplomat said, her tone perfectly modulated as was proper for Xylosians. "Your work on the Rigelian Proxima negotiations has been noted. The ambassador is pleased." "Thank you, senior advisor. I am gratified to have served effectively." However, the older Xylosian continued, her multichromatic eyes fixed on Lyra with uncomfortable intensity. "There have been reports of your movements during off-duty hours that raise concerns." Lyra maintained her composed expression through sheer force of will. "Reports? You have been observed repeatedly entering the residential quarters for transport personnel, specifically the quarters of a human cargo pilot." The words hung in the air between them. Lyra had known, of course, that her visits to Jax weren't entirely discreet, but she hadn't realized they were being actively monitored. "I have been conducting cultural research," she said carefully. "Understanding human perspectives provides valuable context for negotiations with human delegations." The senior advisor's expression didn't change, but her tone cooled further. Such research would normally be conducted through official channels, with proper documentation and supervised conditions. "The opportunity arose unexpectedly," Lyra replied, hating how defensive she sounded. "Regardless of how it arose, it must cease. Your presence in those quarters has generated speculation that reflects poorly on the Xylosian delegation. The ambassador has received inquiries from other delegations regarding whether you are acting in an official capacity." Shame washed over Lyra, not for her time with Jax, which she couldn't bring herself to regret, but for bringing unwanted attention to her delegation. It was the height of unprofessionalism. "I understand. It will not continue. See that it doesn't. The final negotiations begin tomorrow, and the ambassador requires your complete focus and unblemished reputation." The senior advisor turned to leave, then paused. "I would also suggest you review the treatise on emotional discipline. Your responses during this conversation have been less controlled than expected from someone of your rank." After the senior advisor left, Lyra sat motionless at her desk. Logic dictated a clear course of action: cease all contact with Jax, focus entirely on the summit, and work to repair any damage to her professional reputation. And yet, the thought of never returning to his quarters, never seeing his smile or hearing his perspective on the universe, created a hollow sensation in her chest that no amount of Xylosian discipline could entirely suppress. Her device chimed with a message from Jax: "Haven't seen you in days." Station's not the same without a disapproving Xylosian critiquing my living space. "Hope the summit's going well." She stared at it for a long moment, then reluctantly set the device aside without responding. Duty must come first. It always had. The next day, as Lyra was preparing for the final negotiation session, An alert sounded throughout the diplomatic corridor. Security personnel appeared at every junction, their expressions grim. "What's happening?" she asked one as they directed delegates to secure rooms. "Security breach in the station's central systems," the officer replied tersely. "All diplomatic functions are suspended until we verify there's no threat to the delegations." Confined to her quarters with only limited information, Lyra found herself growing increasingly concerned. Not just for the summit, which could be rescheduled, but for everyone on the station, including Jax. The transport quarters were far from the diplomatic sector. Were they affected? Were they safe? Hours passed with only sporadic updates. The breach was contained. No, it had spread to life support systems. No, that was a false alarm, but communications were affected. Delegates were instructed to remain in their quarters. Unable to focus on her work, Lyra paced the small, perfectly organized space that suddenly felt more confining than peaceful. She kept checking her device, hoping for a message from Jax, but there was nothing. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, her door chimed. She opened it to find not a security officer as expected, but Jax himself, looking disheveled and out of place in the pristine diplomatic sector. "Jax, how did you—" "Maintenance corridors," he said quickly, glancing over his shoulder. "Not exactly supposed to be here, but I had to make sure you were okay." The transport corridor got word there was some kind of attack on the diplomatic sector. Not an attack, a security breach, she corrected automatically, then shook her head. "You shouldn't be here. If you're discovered—" "Yeah, I know, diplomatic incident, probably get fired, maybe arrested. Worth it to make sure you're safe." His eyes scanned her face with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. "You are okay, right?" "I am unharmed," she assured him. "But you must leave before security conducts their next patrol." Instead of leaving, he stepped further into her quarters, the door sliding shut behind him. "I've been worried. You stopped responding to messages, and then with this security thing. I was instructed to cease contact with you," she interrupted, the words emerging more abruptly than she intended. "My visits to your quarters have drawn unwanted attention to the Xylosian delegation." Jax's expression fell. "Oh, I see. It is a matter of professional duty," she continued, feeling an irrational need to explain. "The summit negotiations are at a critical stage, and any distraction or impropriety, right? Can't have a Xylosian diplomat hanging out with a cargo jockey. Bad for the image." His tone was light, but she could see the hurt beneath it. "That is not," she began, then stopped, unable to deny the essential truth of his statement. "My personal preferences are irrelevant. My duty to my people must take precedence." "Your personal preferences?" he repeated, focusing on those 3 words with surprising intensity. "So you do prefer spending time with me? It's not just diplomatic research." Lyra felt trapped between honesty and duty. The disciplined Xylosian path was clear: reaffirm her commitment to professional standards, send him away, return fully to her diplomatic role. "And yet, being with you has been significant to me," she admitted quietly, "in ways I had not anticipated, in ways that are not entirely logical." Jax moved closer, his expression softening. "Lyra." The station-wide alert system blared again, causing both of them to jump. An automated voice announced, "Security breach contained. All systems returning to normal operation. Delegates may resume scheduled activities. Additional security measures will remain in place until further notice." The sudden intrusion of reality broke the moment between them. Lyra stepped back, regaining her composure. "You must go. Security will be conducting verification sweeps of all diplomatic quarters." "Lyra, we need to talk about this. About us." "There is no us to discuss," she said, the words feeling like small betrayals as they left her mouth. "There is only duty, propriety, and the diplomatic interests of our respective peoples." Pain flashed across his face, quickly masked. "If that's what you want." "What I want is irrelevant," she repeated, more to herself than to him. Jax looked at her for a long moment, then nodded once. "I understand. For what it's worth, I'm glad I met you, Lyra. You've changed how I see things, how I see myself." Before she could respond, he slipped back through the door, disappearing into the corridor beyond. Lyra stood motionless in the center of her perfectly ordered quarters, feeling as though something essential had been torn away from her. It was illogical, irrational, and undeniable. The summit concluded successfully 2 days later. The negotiations had been complex, but in the end, agreements were reached that satisfied all major delegations. Lyra's contributions were specifically commended by the ambassador, with hints that promotion might be forthcoming. She should have felt satisfied, vindicated in her choice to recommit fully to her duties. Instead, she moved through the final ceremonies like an automaton, giving perfect responses without truly engaging, observing everything while feeling oddly disconnected from it all. The Xylosian delegation was scheduled to depart the following morning. Lyra completed her final reports, packed her few personal items, and prepared for return to Xylos, where she would undoubtedly be assigned to ever more important diplomatic missions. Her career trajectory was exactly as she had always planned. And yet, as the station's night cycle began and most delegates retired to rest before departure, she found herself walking not to her quarters, but through now familiar corridors that led to the transport sector. She told herself she was merely seeking closure, that it was logical to properly conclude their acquaintance rather than leaving matters unresolved. It was a transparent rationalization, but she clung to it nonetheless. When she reached his door, however, she hesitated. What would she say? What could she say? That she was leaving in the morning, returning to a life where there was no place for human cargo pilots, or cluttered rooms, or conversations that challenged everything she had been taught to believe. Before she could decide, the door slid open. Jax stood there, looking as surprised to see her as she was to have been detected. "The door still recognizes you," he explained awkwardly. I never reset the permissions." "I see," she said, struggling to maintain her composure. "I came to inform you that the Xylosian delegation departs tomorrow. I wish to express appreciation for your cultural insights, which proved valuable during negotiations." Jax's expression hardened slightly. "Is that really why you came?" "For a formal thank you. It is the appropriate diplomatic protocol." "I don't want diplomatic protocol, Lyra. I just want you to be honest. With me and with yourself." The request was simple, and yet it struck at the core of everything she had been taught to value. Honesty without strategic calculation, emotions acknowledged without filtering through logic. It was counterproductive, unprofessional, and suddenly desperately important. "I came because I could not leave without seeing you again," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "Because despite all logic and duty and propriety, I find myself missing you when we are apart, thinking of you during diplomatic discussions, wondering what you would say about certain arguments or positions. It is inefficient, distracting, and entirely unlike me." Jax's expression softened. He stepped back, gesturing for her to enter. "Come in, please." She hesitated only a moment before stepping inside. The room was just as cluttered as always, but she noticed he had cleared a small space on the couch, as though he'd been hoping she might return. "I've missed you too," he said simply, closing the door behind her. "More than makes any sense for someone I've only known for a few weeks." They stood facing each other, the air between them charged with unspoken possibilities and equally unspoken limitations. "I depart tomorrow," she reminded him, as if either of them could have forgotten. "I know." Jax ran a hand through his hair, a gesture she had come to recognize as a sign of his frustration or uncertainty. "I've been trying to figure out what to say if I saw you again. I had this whole speech planned about cultural exchange and logical arguments for why you should stay in touch. But now that you're here, now that I am here, none of it seems to matter. All that matters is that when you're gone, there will be a Lyra-shaped hole in my life, and I don't think anything's going to fill it." The raw honesty of his statement hit her with unexpected force. Xylosians did not speak this way, directly, emotionally, without careful consideration of strategic impact. And yet, she found herself responding to it, drawn to its authenticity. "Your presence in my life has been equally significant," she admitted. "You have shown me perspectives I would never have considered, experiences I would never have permitted myself to have. That's a very diplomatic way of saying you like hanging out with me, he said, a hint of his usual humor returning. I do. Like hanging out with you, she replied, the casual human phrase feeling strange but right on her tongue. More than is rational. Jax stepped closer, close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his eyes, the slight unevenness of his features that made his face so expressive and uniquely human. Rationality's overrated, he said softly. So, I am beginning to understand, she whispered. For a moment, it seemed as though he might close the remaining distance between them. Whether to embrace her as humans sometimes did in greeting, or something more, she wasn't certain. But he stopped himself, respecting the boundaries of her culture and her own uncertainty. Instead, he asked, what happens now? You go back to Xylos, resume your perfectly logical life, and forget about the messy human who messed up your perfectly ordered existence. I could never forget you, she said with more intensity than she had intended. But yes, I must return to my duties. My people need me. My skills serve an important function in maintaining interstellar peace and cooperation. I know. I wouldn't ask you to give that up. He sighed, turning to look out the small viewport where stars glittered against the blackness. And let's face it, I'm not exactly diplomat material. Can you imagine me at one of your formal functions? I'd probably cause an interstellar incident within 5 minutes. The mental image almost made her smile despite the ache in her chest. Your approach to diplomacy would certainly be unconventional. They fell silent, both acutely aware of the impossibility of their situation. Different species, different lives, different responsibilities. Everything logical said this connection, whatever it was, had nowhere to go. And yet she remained there, unwilling to leave, to end this strange chapter of her life that had brought such unexpected meaning. Will you ever come back to Nexus? Jax asked finally. Is possible. Interstellar diplomatic functions are often held here due to its central location. So maybe someday, perhaps, she allowed, though they both knew the likelihood of them crossing paths again, let alone finding the freedom to spend time together, was minimal. Jax turned back to her, his expression shifting to something more resolved. In that case, I want to give you something. A memory to take with you. He moved to a cluttered shelf and retrieved a small object, the Tau Ceti puzzle she had solved on her first visit. I want you to have this. I cannot accept, she began automatically. Please, I've solved it already. And whenever you look at it, maybe you will remember that sometimes the most interesting solutions come from unexpected angles. The double meaning wasn't lost on her. Slowly, she reached out and took the puzzle, their fingers brushing momentarily in the exchange. Thank you, she said softly. I will treasure it. And maybe, if you're ever back on Nexus. He left the sentence hanging, an open invitation. I would very much like to see you again, should circumstances permit, she said formally, but they both heard the emotion beneath the words. Lyra knew she should leave. Each moment prolonged their parting, made it more difficult. And yet she lingered, memorizing his face, his cluttered room. The feeling of being in this place where, for a brief time, she had been free to simply be herself rather than the perfect Xylosian diplomat. Finally, she stepped toward the door. I must go. There are final preparations before tomorrow's departure. Jax nodded, understanding as always. Safe travels, Lyra. And be happy, okay? Even if that means being a little less logical sometimes. I shall endeavor to find an optimal balance, she replied, a hint of uncharacteristic humor in her tone. At the door, she turned one last time. Goodbye, Jax. See you among the stars, Ambassador. He replied with a sad smile, using the title she didn't yet have but they both knew she would someday earn. The door closed between them with a soft hiss, and Lyra stood alone in the corridor, the puzzle clutched in her hand, feeling as though she had left something essential of herself behind in that cluttered room. The journey back to Xylos passed in a blur of reports and preparations. Lyra performed her duties with her usual efficiency, but inside, she felt fundamentally changed. Every logical argument, every diplomatic strategy, she now examined from multiple angles, including perspectives that would have seemed irrelevant to her before meeting Jax. Back on her homeworld, She resumed her position in the diplomatic corps with renewed focus. Her superiors noted her enhanced performance, her ability to anticipate objections and find creative solutions to deadlocked negotiations. What they didn't know was that in many of these moments, she was imagining what Jax might say, how he might approach the problem from his uniquely human perspective. At night, alone in her pristinely organized quarters, she would sometimes take out the puzzle he had given her. She never attempted to solve it again. It remained in the solution state, exactly as it had been when he handed it to her. Instead, she would simply hold it, remembering conversations under the stars, laughter over strange human foods, and the feeling of being accepted completely, imperfections and all. Months passed. Her career advanced, as predicted. There were new negotiations, new crises, new successes. She began to mentor younger diplomats, surprising herself by encouraging them to consider unconventional approaches and perspectives, though always within the bounds of Xylosian propriety, of course. Occasionally, she would hear news of Nexus Station through official channels. Once, there was even a brief mention of improved efficiency in transport operations under a new coordination system. She wondered if Jax had been involved, if he was still there, still living in that wonderfully chaotic room that had briefly been her sanctuary. She never initiated contact. It would have been inappropriate, unprofessional. But sometimes, looking out at the stars from the windows of diplomatic vessels or foreign embassies, she would find herself searching for particular constellations, ones that would be visible from Nexus. One standard year after the summit, Lyra was preparing for another major diplomatic mission when she received a message from her superior. The Interspecies Cultural Exchange Initiative requires a Xylosian representative, the senior advisor informed her. Your experience with multiple species and unconventional diplomatic approaches makes you an optimal candidate. The Cultural Exchange Initiative? Lyra asked, unfamiliar with the program. A new effort to improve interspecies understanding through extended immersion experiences. Representatives live and work alongside members of other species, learning their customs firsthand rather than through formal study. Something stirred in Lyra's chest, a feeling she had carefully managed but never entirely suppressed. Where would this assignment be based? Nexus Station. Its position as an interspecies hub makes it ideal for the program. Nexus, where Jax was, or at least where he had been, where they had met, talked, connected in ways that defied logical explanation. The assignment would require significant adaptation to non-Xylosian customs and living arrangements. Her superior continued. Many would find it challenging to maintain proper discipline in such an environment. If you prefer a more traditional diplomatic posting, I accept the assignment, Lyra interrupted, surprising both herself and the senior advisor with her decisiveness. Very well, the older Xylosian replied after a moment's pause. You depart in one standard week. I trust you will represent Xylos with appropriate dignity despite the program's unconventional nature. Of course, Lyra assured her, maintaining a properly composed expression despite the sudden racing of her pulse. I shall endeavor to optimize cultural exchange opportunities while upholding Xylosian principles. As she prepared for the assignment, Lyra told herself repeatedly that the possibility of seeing Jax again was merely an incidental factor in her decision. The Cultural Exchange Initiative was an important diplomatic opportunity. Her experiences would benefit Xylosian understanding of other species. Her career would advance in valuable new directions. All of these things were true, but as her transport ship approached Nexus Station, she found herself standing by the viewport, watching the massive structure grow larger, with the puzzle Jax had given her clutched tightly in her hand and a very un-Xylosian flutter of anticipation in her chest. She had no guarantee he would still be there. No guarantee he would want to see her if he was. No guarantee that the connection they had formed a year ago would still exist after so much time apart. But for once in her life, Lyra was willing to embrace uncertainty, to step into a situation without a perfectly calculated outcome. It was illogical, inefficient, and entirely unlike the diplomat she had been trained to be. It was, she thought with a small smile that would have shocked her former colleagues, exactly what Jax would do. As the docking procedures began, Lyra looked out at the stars surrounding Nexus Station, the same stars they had watched together from a small viewport. Somewhere on that station, perhaps, was a cluttered room where a human pilot might still be eating sugary cereal, watching old Earth sports, and collecting puzzles from across the galaxy. She didn't know what would happen when she disembarked. She didn't know if she would find him, or if he would welcome her return. She didn't know how she would balance duty and desire, logic and emotion, the person she had been trained to be and the person she was becoming. But as the docking bay doors opened before her, Lyra stepped forward with more certainty than she had felt in the past year. Whatever happened next, she would face it not just with Xylosian logic, but with the perspective he had given her, that sometimes the most valuable answers come from the most unexpected directions. And sometimes the most logical choice is to follow your heart.